All right, this is Mr. Barr. I just wanted to give you a lecture on Reconstruction. So this is going to be the first of a series of video lectures I'm going to try. Hopefully this helps us navigate through this process a little bit easier. If it doesn't work, we'll go back to something else. But the next topic of our conversation is going to be Reconstruction. So we need to spend our time on Reconstruction for a little bit and discuss what life was like after the Civil War. If you're doing this in person, you can take notes on your note sheet. If you're watching this at home, first off, I hope you get better. Second of all, feel free just to answer the questions that I've posted to Schoology, and you should be set. Okay. First off, Reconstruction was the plan to readmit the former Confederate states into the Union. Okay, so after the Civil War, the biggest thing we had to worry about was how do we readmit these states? How do we bring the country back together? And like anything else, there was lots of debate, discussion, and ideas about how to do that. Some wanted to harshly punish the South. Some wanted to just say, forget it, let's let the South back in. Some didn't want to let them in at all, and really wanted to make them pay a price for starting the Civil War. We ended up in the middle somewhere, and we never really got to the point of Reconstruction. We'll get to that in a little while. The big problem was this whole thing was made more complicated because Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and Congress all had different ideas about what Reconstruction would look like. Lincoln, as you know, is going to get assassinated, so that's going to the president right about a month into his second term. So the presidency is going to fall on Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from the South, from Tennessee. So Johnson's going to have the same idea that Lincoln does, but not implemented in the same way. And there's going to be a huge conflict between Andrew Johnson and Congress that's going to take so much of his time. In fact, it's going to lead to his impeachment as president. But at the same time, it's also going to take away from really implementing any kind of coherent policy for Reconstruction. That power struggle over Reconstruction will define American politics for the rest of the 1870s and basically till the turn of the century. Lincoln favored a lenient Reconstruction policy. In fact, his plan was called the 10% Plan. In his second inaugural address in March of 1865, he used the quote, "with malice toward none and charity for all," to describe his plan for Reconstruction. The technical term that historians use is the 10% Plan, and here's what that looked like. As soon as 10% of the people who voted in 1860 took an oath, a Confederate state would form a new government and send representatives to Congress. They had to form a new government because their old one was the Confederate government that was no longer part of the U.S. government. So they had to abolish that old state government when they were part of the Confederate States and send new representatives, congressmen and senators, to Washington to represent that state in the Congress. And that would happen as soon as 10% of the people who voted in 1860 took an oath of loyalty. Lincoln's plan was opposed by radical Republicans. Radical Republicans is just a name for a faction or a group of Republican members of Congress who wanted to punish former slaveholders, really make them pay a price for slavery, which they viewed as the cause of the war, and then give African Americans full citizenship and the right to vote. People like Thaddeus Stevens see this as their moment. This is their chance to finally get suffrage for all those slaves, the right to vote for all those slaves who didn't have it before. Lincoln says, whoa, let's put the brakes on, let's get the states back in, and we'll talk about that. Lincoln was much more practical and say, okay, but this is what we can actually get done. Radical Republicans wanted to push the envelope and get as much done as they quickly could. Johnson favored Lincoln's plan. He supported it with a small exception. His plan did not make high-ranking Confederates and wealthy Southerners take that oath of allegiance. So they didn't have to take an oath of allegiance if you were a high-ranking Confederate or a wealthy Southerner. He basically believed that whites should rule the South and African Americans should not have the right to vote, nor really any rights at all. Many moderate Republicans tried to pass laws that fixed the weaknesses they saw in Johnson's plan. Johnson just kept vetoing them and sending them back and saying, nope, not signing that. Nope, not signing that. If it didn't fit into that very discriminatory approach that he took, then he didn't sign the law. One thing they did do, though, was they kind of found a workaround. So instead of making African Americans full citizens, they did try to make their lives just a tad bit better. In 1866, Congress enlarged something called the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau assisted former slaves and poor whites by distributing clothing and food to them and really giving them a leg up. Angered by Johnson's actions, radical and moderate Republicans worked together to shift control of Reconstruction from the executive branch to the legislative branch. Again, that conflict, in fact, is going to lead to Johnson's impeachment because he's going to fire the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, in response to Congress passing the Tenure of Office Act, which made it impossible for the president to fire an official without the approval of Congress. He thinks that Stanton is Congress's man and is going to prevent him from implementing his Reconstruction ideas. He's going to get impeached for that. He's going to escape conviction by one vote, but that conflict is going to make it really difficult for them to implement any kind of Reconstruction plan. They overrode Johnson's veto, so when the president vetoes a law, that veto can be overridden by Congress if there's a 2/3 vote in each house. And they did pass the 14th Amendment, which provided equal protection for all races. So again, African Americans maybe didn't get the right, like, full citizenship yet, but the 14th Amendment was a big step in that direction. While Congress and the president were trying to hash out how to reconstruct the government side of it, we had to go about reconstructing society, and a lot of this happened with the ingenuity of the American people, and they just figured it out. The war devastated the South economically. Farms were destroyed. Factories, what little there were gone. They no longer had slavery to rely on as an economic engine to fuel their agriculture. So they really struggled economically after the war. There were, however, 3 major groups who worked together to really try to achieve their goals in rebuilding the South. One was carpetbaggers, who are Northerners who moved to the South to try to help rebuild it. Scallywags, who were white Southerners who joined the Republican Party. I mean, these people were smart. They understood, hey, the Republican Party, being the party of anti-slavery, is probably going to dominate American politics for a few years, so we better jump on the bandwagon. It's not so much that they agreed with it, but they just dealt with it. They joined the party to try to protect themselves and give themselves a leg up in case that happened. And then African Americans, Hiram Revels does become the first African American member of Congress. So again, small progress for African Americans after Reconstruction, but even though slavery was ended with the 13th Amendment, still not any significant progress to be proud of. Okay. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, we never really settled on a system that made sense. For example, African Americans were still stuck in this vicious cycle of slavery. But we didn't call it that. We called it sharecropping. Here's what sharecroppers were. Sharecroppers were former slaves and poor whites, and essentially what would happen is landowners divided their land and assigned each head of household a few acres, along with seeds and tools. Sharecroppers kept a small share of their crops and gave the rest to landowners. Say that again. Sharecroppers kept a small share of their crops and gave the rest to landowners. So they paid the landowner to farm the land that they owned. Sounds like slavery. It is. It's slavery 2.0. Okay, sharecropping and slavery are essentially the same thing. Okay, yeah, it wasn't technically mandatory, but it couldn't have really been voluntary either. You couldn't afford that. Farms were so devastated after the war that the farmers really had no choice. They had to be sharecroppers if they wanted to feed their families. So the South did a terrible job of lifting up former slaves after the war. Instead, they kept them locked in this vicious cycle, and it made the relationship between the two races even worse. It was not well received by whites. In fact, an entire organization, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was formed, and the goal was to destroy the Republican Party for supporting African American rights. That was the whole goal of the KKK. Obviously, it's turned into abolishing all African Americans to begin with. It's a terrible organization, but its original goal was to destroy the Republican Party for supporting African American rights. Like anything else, it's going to come to an end at some point, but support for Reconstruction programs in the Republican Party began to drop. They just got tired of it. They could see that it wasn't working. The South just refused to accept it. They refused to accept blacks. They refused to give them more whites. Blacks are being killed and lynched and hung. They were still stuck in sharecropping, so slavery never really went away, even though it was illegal with the 13th Amendment. Yeah. The Supreme Court also declared various laws passed by Congress to be unconstitutional, which basically cancels or voids them and makes them not applicable. So essentially the court stepping in and voiding everything Congress did anyway. Reconstruction really ended when, in 1876, there was a disputed election between the Democrat, Samuel Tilden, and the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes. What happened is Tilden won the popular vote. In other words, he got more actual votes, but was one electoral vote shy of the majority that he needed to win. When that happens in the Constitution, it says that the election is held in the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives was controlled by Democrats. They compromised and basically said, if you pull troops out of the South and leave us alone and end Reconstruction, because there were military troops there to try to enforce African Americans being able to vote, forcing ending slavery, things like that. Ulysses S. Grant had sent troops down. In exchange for removing those troops, the Democrats gave the election to the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. The Republicans accepted that. The troops left, and Reconstruction was over. Not much progress was made. It did produce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which historians call the Reconstruction Amendment. So there were some progress made, but not enough for us to be proud of. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks for listening.